The currency that feels safest is the US dollar. But it's the one now being cornered, and if you're saving, sitting cash, you're closer to a break than you think. There were no alarms, no headlines screaming collapse, but a vault door opened in Switzerland, and $1 trillion began to move in a way that would change everything. For decades, one truth felt unshakable. If you held dollars, you held safety. That assumption built empires, funded wars, and gave Washington the power to decide who thrived and who starved. It was the backbone of trade, the oxygen of markets. But when the safest banker in the world decides that safety is gone, you should feel the ground shift under your feet. Switzerland just did the unthinkable. They reduced their dependence on the dollar and elevated the euro, gold, and other assets to nearly equal footing. This isn't a rumor whispered online. This is the world's third-largest reserve bank, with over $1 trillion in foreign currency reserves, quietly admitting the dollar is no longer untouchable. And here's why that should terrify Washington. Central banks do not gamble. They do not chase headlines or react to tweets. They move like glaciers, slow, unstoppable, and devastating once the ice starts to crack. When Switzerland makes a move, it is not noise. It's a signal flare. And that flare just told the world that the age of dollar supremacy is ending. Now pause and imagine what happens if this spreads. Japan holds reserves bigger than most continents. The Gulf states hold oceans of petrodollars. If even one of them follows Switzerland's lead, demand for the dollar falls off a cliff. And when demand collapses for the currency America prints at will, the entire foundation shakes. That is how empires slip. Not with a bang, but with a balance sheet. And Switzerland just pushed the first domino. Why would they do this now? Because Washington turned the dollar into a weapon. Sanctions, blockades, threats. What was once a neutral tool became a political hammer. And once money becomes a hammer, every nation asks, when will it fall on us? Switzerland doesn't need sanctions to know the risk. They saw $37 trillion debt, endless deficits, and a dollar index down double digits this year. So they hedged. They diversified. And while politicians reassure citizens that the dollar is resilient, central banks are voting with their gold bars and euros instead. Here's the kicker most people miss. Central banks don't announce a crisis, they prepare for it in silence. They do not warn the public. They move first, and the crowd finds out later. That is why this matters, because by the time the headlines confirm it, the shift will already be irreversible, and Switzerland's move is proof the process has begun. Now let's talk about what changes for you. The cost of money itself shifts when the dollar weakens. Imports rise in price. Borrowing costs rise as trust erodes. The prestige premium America enjoyed for 80 years begins to fade. Loyalty turns into hedging. That hedging shows up as more gold in vaults, more euros on ledgers, and more experiments with regional or blockchain settlement systems. You don't need to wait for a crash to feel it. It shows up in food, fuel, and debt costs before the news admits it. And here's where the retention problem hits home. Markets move before governments admit the truth. Investors move before voters understand what happened. And when both of those tides shift, the ordinary saver is always the last to realize their purchasing power is gone. So what happens next? The script is already written. Another major reserve holder will follow Switzerland, then another. At first it will feel boring, like technical adjustments. Then one day the crowd will wake up and realize the dollar is no longer the only pillar holding up the system. That realization will not rebuild trust, it will accelerate the run. History proves this. Rome, Britain, every empire that leaned on its currency eventually faced the same slow erosion. The dollar is not immune. It is already bleeding influence. Switzerland just told us the bleeding has started. You are not supposed to hear this plainly. But the signs are there for anyone who can read the balance sheets. This is not a prediction. This is a process that has already begun. The only question left is how fast the dominoes fall and how prepared you are when the crowd finally notices. Switzerland cast its vote with $1 trillion balance sheet, and that vote was not for the dollar. Stay ahead of the curve and turn the quiet moves of the elites into your advantage. Think about what that means in practice. Every trade route, every debt auction, every import contract that once assumed dollar dominance is now questioning it. Confidence erodes slowly, the reallocations that barely make the news until it's too late. Gold is now surging as a share of reserves. In the first quarter alone, central banks bought more than 240 metric tons. That is not diversification for style points. That is insurance against the collapse of a story the world no longer believes. The euro, despite its flaws, has gained double digits this year against the dollar. The yuan is creeping into official reserves at levels unthinkable a decade ago. And remember, these are not speculators. These are the most cautious institutions on earth, quietly hedging against the end of an era. History tells us the script does not change. When one empire overextends, others quietly prepare the exit. The British pound once sat on the throne of global trade. Then came war, debt, and the slow erosion of trust. The same pattern is repeated now with the dollar. Most will scoff until savings buy less, debt costs more, and leaders admit the problem after the pain. But you do not need to wait for that day. You are watching it unfold in slow motion. The signals are right in front of you. Central banks are moving their pieces before the game resets. Switzerland did not write a press release. They shifted reserves. They did not declare a new order. They built an escape route. That is how elites prepare, silently. Not with words, but with moves you were not supposed to notice. Ask yourself, why would the safest banker on earth reduce their dollar holdings now? Because they see the trajectory no politician can admit. 37 trillion in U.S. debt, deficits that will not be contained. A dollar index sliding even as officials insist everything is fine. The truth is in allocations, not speeches. This is why de-dollarization is no longer theory. It is a fact, confirmed by the actions of the very institutions designed to be cautious above all else. And once the cautious move, the crowd eventually follows. You cannot stop the tide when it begins at the top. The world is rebalancing toward multiple anchors, euro, gold, yuan, and neutral systems that clear trades without politics. Optionality is safety. Neutrality is power. And the dollar's free ride is over. Picture the ordinary saver watching the news tonight. They will hear nothing about Switzerland's move. They will hear politicians repeating the same tired reassurance that the dollar is strong, that nothing has changed. But under the surface, the guardians of money have already made their choice. They built lifeboats while passengers enjoyed the cruise. That gap is where fortunes are lost and built. And here's the hardest truth. By the time the public sees the storm, escape routes will be closed. The elites already moved. They did it in silence, in spreadsheets, in vaults. The message is clear. The dollar is no longer untouchable. And if you ignore that message, you risk being the last one left in a system that has already shifted. This is how the greatest wealth transfers in history begin. Quietly, with choices made behind closed doors. Then all at once, consequences hit those who waited too long. Switzerland lit the fuse. The question is how fast it spreads and how ready you are when it reaches your door. If you want more of these signals decoded early, subscribe now. Stay ahead of the curve and turn the quiet moves of the elites into your advantage.